Yesterday we looked at a few introductory things in relationship to the Passion narrative of the Gospel of Mark. First thing today is to look at that word itself, passion. It has at least two meanings, or there are two ways to look at it. If you know anything about the word itself, you know it comes from a Latin word, and that word is patior. Basically, patior in Latin means to suffer, means to endure or to bear. By and large, it has a passive understanding. Something happens to us, we receive it. When we speak of Christ's passion, we refer to his suffering, death that he had to endure. So that's one aspect of passion, but there's another, and we're familiar with that too. In English, this other connotation of passion, it can mean emotion, feeling, commitment, those kinds of things. We can say people do things with a passion. Where I live, people say in Indiana that the people from Indiana take their basketball passionately. Well, that's true. But everybody knows what that means when you say that, the kind of emotion and commitment. And of course, in Indiana, in the U.S. in general, March is called March Madness. There's a huge basketball tourney that goes on. Most of the teams I picked to win had now lost. So I might as well be here talking and watching that. Both aspects of the term passion need to be kept in mind when we talk about the passion narrative in the Gospels. Jesus of Nazareth was indeed condemned to die, and the cross was imposed on him, and that certainly qualifies that as passion. And he was, in this sense, understood as a victim. And oftentimes, the notion of passion implies the notion of a victim who suffers and who dies. The other side, however, is also present. It's not just when you think of the passion narrative, you think of poor Jesus, he got beat up, he died, all of that sort of thing. That is there. But remember, there's the other side too. Crucifixion did not all of a sudden appear as a surprise to Jesus. It's not like he was caught off guard and he didn't have any idea that any of this could happen. That's not the case at all. The Gospels make it very clear that the hostility that is demonstrated against Jesus was the result of his own mission. His own mission is what brought about his own death. And he knows that. He doesn't always look on that as a great thing. And when he goes into the Garden of Gethsemane, he would certainly like to see if this could be changed. But he's not caught off guard. He knows how this is going to be. And it's his commitment to his mission, which is a passionate commitment. That is what is behind this notion, the positive notion, in a sense, of passion. He purposely puts himself on a collision course with his opponents. And he knows what can happen if he continues to do that. Remember, early on in the Gospel of Mark, there's an interesting little passage in chapter 3 where after he has been doing some preaching and after he has been doing some healing, and one of the ways he upsets people, his opponents, like the Pharisees, is he will do a healing in the synagogue on the Sabbath, which is a blatant violation of the Torah, doing work on the Sabbath. The only kind of work that was permitted on the Sabbath was work that had to be done to preserve life. Well, there in chapter 3, if you read, you'll notice he heals a man with a withered arm. Now, most of the time, people with withered arms don't die of a withered arm. You certainly are inconvenienced, no doubt about that, but he could have waited. He could have said, okay, I know who you are. You come back tomorrow. It won't be the Sabbath. You come back tomorrow and we'll take care of that. But not him. It's on the Sabbath, in the synagogue, a guy with a withered arm, and he kind of looks around to make sure everybody's going to see this, and then he does it. Well, you can see where that's going to end up. And he purposely puts the authorities in that kind of a situation. And so the next verse we hear, there in chapter 3, after he does this healing, the next thing we hear is his family came to take him away because they thought he was crazy. Well, that begins a whole series of things with him and his family and his hometown and his disciples. A theme that runs through Mark is a theme of rejection. The theme of rejection. But you see, in many ways, it's not accidental. It's not like he bent over backwards trying to make sure that nobody got upset. Matter of fact, when you read the Gospels a little more carefully, you get the impression that he kind of got into upsetting people. You know, if he could get you to be a little more edgy, get you to be just a little more on edge about what's going to happen, he seemed to like that. He seemed to like that. In many ways, when you read the Gospel, you could say Jesus himself chose death. And he chose death as part of what his mission was. So all of that sort of thinking needs to be in the back of our mind when we think about the Passion narrative. Now, technically, the Passion narrative in Mark starts in chapter 14, but really it starts way before then. There is preparation that begins almost as soon as the gospel itself begins. Now remember how the gospel begins, and you also have to keep in mind, if we were the community here right now, for which this gospel was written, Mark is writing this gospel to us, remember, this is the only gospel we would know. Unlike ourselves. You can read Mark, and if you don't like it, you think, well, he left out a whole bunch of stuff. You can go over, as people tend to do, and find some other stuff and read that, and maybe get themselves thinking that makes it better. That's kind of the whole story. Really isn't, but that's how people think. They can do that because we have 4 Gospels available to us. The earliest Christians did not. Matthew had Matthew, Luke had Luke, John had John. And Mark, we would have just had this. And so when you open up the Gospel of Mark, the first sentence you read is the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. There is no stories of baby Jesus. There is no stories of angels, no annunciations, none of that other beginning that we're so used to having. Not even that long prologue in the Gospel of John. Just one short profession of faith. But it is a very strong profession of faith. It tells you everything Mark believes about Jesus. I believe the beginning of the good news, the Gospel of Jesus Christ. Christ is a profession. Christ is the understanding of who Jesus is. Jesus the anointed. And remember, that's okay. We can go that far. But then we go further, because then we say, the Son of God. And so we've laid it all out. That's what Mark believes, and that's how he starts. Then, you'll notice what happened. If you read the gospel, you know, immediately he goes to talk about John the Baptist. And John the Baptist is portrayed as this voice in the wilderness. Quotations from at least Isaiah chapter 40, probably Malachi chapter 2, Exodus chapter 3. And if you'd say, well, why put all three of those together? It's in one sentence. Well, because Mark doesn't have any of this written down. He doesn't have a big book or anything he's carrying around with. He's doing all this by memory. And when you have a lot of things in memory, sometimes you just sort of put things together that don't always belong together. But it sounds good. And as you get older, if you're not already older, I'll tell you, you're going to do that more and more. John the Baptist is portrayed as the last of the prophets. He's the last person of the old age, and his function is basically one. He comes to prepare the way for the new age. And so Mark very quickly has him do that. He comes on the stage, he talks about the coming of the new age, he proclaims a baptism for the repentance of sins. And then very quickly, Mark will have Jesus go through some of these events. Very quickly, he will get baptized. And then very quickly, he'll be led out into the desert to be tempted by the devil. And then he will be off and running. Keep in mind also that John serves another purpose. John, and the way Mark portrays him, John is going to be an example, a symbol for us of what's going to happen to Jesus. If you follow the story of John the Baptist in the Gospel, you will notice he's going to get arrested. He does not think that Herod and his marriage situation is a very good one, and so he decides to bring it up to Herod, and Herod isn't real happy with that. So the next thing you know, John is incarcerated, and that whole thing ends up in him being beheaded. So he is arrested, he's betrayed, and he's executed. Same thing going to happen to Jesus. In a way, John the Baptist does prepare the way. But it's more than just the way of the new age. It's the way of Jesus. As John the Baptist goes, so will go Jesus. As John continues to write, unfold this, there are two plots that are presented against Jesus' life. One plot happens early on, and it happens up in Galilee. Remember how Jesus operates as soon as he's off and running. And remember, after John the Baptist is arrested, we're told Jesus came into Galilee proclaiming the good news and saying, and then here's the first time we hear Jesus say anything. The time is fulfilled. The kingdom of God has drawn near. Repent and believe in the good news. That comes in chapter 1, verse 15. It's the mission statement of Jesus. If you want to know what Jesus himself thinks he's about, one sentence. One sentence, sort of the nutshell. Scholars call it the programmatic text, which is a fancy way of saying nutshell. What it is, it's a summary. If you understand that whole thing, the time is fulfilled. Kingdom of God has come near. Repent and believe in the good news. And so he goes up in Galilee immediately. That's up north. He likes Galilee. Mark loves Galilee. Galilee's a place of life. Everything good that happens to Jesus happens in Galilee. Everything bad happens in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the place of death for Mark. He has no use for Jerusalem at all. Jesus will go there one time, and he'll go there to be killed. That's it. So, the first time a plot breaks out against Jesus is in chapter 3, early on, starts with verse 6. Here's what it says. The Pharisees went out and immediately conspired with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. Well, why would they want to do that? Well, because he's considered to be a danger. This is what happened right after he healed that man with the withered arm. He deliberately, seemingly breaks the Sabbath law about work and healing. And of course, that's not going to work with those people. So, chapter 3 is the first time we are told that things aren't going well. It's the first time we are given a strong hint, if not just a blatant statement, that the opponents, his religious officials especially, are out to get him. But they won't try anything right away. They're portrayed throughout the gospel as being rather cowardly. Cowardly meaning they don't want to do anything that would upset people, thinking that maybe they moved too quickly, or maybe they were just a bunch of thugs oppressing some poor little itinerant preacher. So they're going to have to wait until a proper time. So that's the first time we know that things are not going to go well. And it's early on, chapter 3. Later on, after he's been in the ministry and done some things, and you get to chapter 11, then you find another thing. Here's chapter 11, verse 18. Now he's headed down to Jerusalem. And what happens, remember, and you'll hear this on Palm Sunday, he gets there and he gets on his donkey and so forth, and he enters the city of Jerusalem. Then it says, as soon as he got in, he went into the temple. And then he looked around. He don't know what he was looking for, but then he comes out. Then he goes over to a fig tree that doesn't have any figs. And the reason it has no figs is, well, it's not the time for figs. No brainer. And he kind of goes berserk. He really lambasts that poor fig tree, telling it that you'll never bear figs again. You know, poor Peter's standing back there. What is all this about? Why on earth are you doing that? Well, he's gone on and on and on. Well, okay, you're supposed to keep that in the back of your mind bone. He cursed this fig tree. Next day, comes back, goes right back into the temple. Up until this time, he's been pretty harmless. He hasn't really done anything that would upset people in terms of physically harming anybody or appearing to be a violent kind of person, almost just the opposite. He just seems to walk around and talk and do some healing. That doesn't seem to hurt anybody. But on this time, he goes in. He knocks over all that stuff about money changers they had there. It's the outer courtyard. If we were in the outer courtyard, we'd know that everybody can go in there. That's not reserved for anybody special. Jews, Gentiles, anybody. And yeah, there were a lot of animals there and people selling animals, and there were people making money exchanges. But whereas you and I might think, well, that's bad because that's commercialism and that's not what you're supposed to do in a house that's dedicated to God, but that's not how it would have been understood at all. Remember, we went down there every year during the High Holy Days to sacrifice our animal. And the law said we had to do it in the temple in Jerusalem. Now, we had tried in the past bringing our own animal. So we hauled that thing all the way down, and we were real happy with it. You know, we got it down there. And of course, before you can sacrifice, the priest has to examine your animal and declare, is it fit or unfit? Is it blemished or unblemished? And so the priest will look at the animal and say, well, that really looks fine, you know, but... And we know as soon as he said that, it's over, you know. But got this bruise over here and this leg over. I'm sorry. Nice animal, but it won't work. But I got one I'll sell you. Now, mind you, they didn't rip you off. Unlike where I live, you'd be ripped off. But here, no, it was really a service. You did this a couple of times and you said, I'm done. I'm never taking an animal there again. Nothing will pass. I can just buy it there. Great. No problem. Second thing you did when you went down to Jerusalem on the High Holy Day, you wanted to pay your temple tax. But here's the problem. You work for or in the environment of the Roman government. All your money, all the coins you have this head of Caesar stamped on it. And then there's some inscriptions about Caesar is God and all that. And the temple will have nothing to do with that. They won't accept that money. So what are you supposed to do? Well, no problem. We have money changers, our own ATMs. Here's what you do. You take your coins, you go over here to the money changer. That person will exchange them for temple money. And then you can go in any of these places and pay your temple tax. Wonderful. Good deal. No one would have thought anything bad about that at all, religious official or anybody. So it's kind of odd, it seems, when Jesus goes in there and all of a sudden kind of goes berserk, knocking over those money changer stuff and the tables and all that stuff where the animals are, and quoting the prophet Jeremiah as well as Isaiah, you have made my father's house a den of thieves, and on and on and on. People saw that. Two kinds of people actually saw that. One would be the religious officials, and they would not have taken kindly to that. The other people who would have seen that and would have been watching carefully would have been the Roman soldiers, and they were not interested in the religious part, but they were interested in anybody doing anything that looks like it could cause excitement or a riot. Because that was the worst thing in those days could happen when you're in a little town of maybe 20,000 that now has over 500,000. It's high religious holy days, the passions and everything is really, you got to keep things calm, and that's what the Roman soldiers were there to do. When you see somebody go berserk in the temple and start screaming and hollering and knocking things over and cursing the place, you have made my father's house a den of thieves, you're going to look carefully at that guy. He's a dangerous kind of a person. So, what was Jesus doing when he did that? What was he really just upset about the buying and the selling? Probably not. He probably could care less. That was what was considered to be a prophetic action. Anybody there would have understood that was a prophetic action. A prophetic action is where sometimes when you read the prophets, especially Isaiah, Jeremiah, and most especially Ezekiel. You ever read the book of Ezekiel? Ezekiel's kind of crazy. He does all kinds of symbolic actions. The function of a symbolic action is to act out the message. You don't speak the message. You do something symbolic. We're all familiar with that. We've all heard of symbolic actions where the action itself might not be so big or so harmful, but what it stands for is. I could take my signs and stand outside this church door here and say, I think this church is corrupt. I don't like anything about this church. I'm not going to hurt the church. And my sign's hardly going to do anything, and people are going to look at me and say, well, there's a nut, and so forth. But they wouldn't just let me keep doing that. Father Anselm wouldn't just say, oh, he's a nut, just let him do it. No, pretty soon he'd call the officials and say, he's causing more damage than it looks like. He says, yeah, this church, but I know he's saying more than that. We better calm this right down. I'd be hauled away. Well, the people inside the temple, the authorities, they knew what Jesus was doing. He was not just condemning money changers and animal sellers. He was condemning the entire temple system. Now remember, that was a system. It wasn't just a building. The Jerusalem temple as a system controlled everything. If we would have been Jews at that time, the temple would have controlled a lot of our social life, our political life, certainly our economic life. And so everybody knew if you ever speak against the temple, God's house, if you ever say anything bad against the temple, that's considered to be blasphemy. And the temple and the penalty for blasphemy was to be stoned, death. And so that's what the religious officials would be looking at. They would say, he has blasphemed this whole temple. Now, he's not the first one to do that. If you go back to your prophet book, Jeremiah sometime, read Jeremiah chapter 7. In Jeremiah chapter 7, Jeremiah is standing on the very steps of the temple. And he's looking at his own Jewish people. These are the people who are absolutely convinced this temple is the house of God, built by Solomon. And that means it is extremely sacred and it'll be here forever. That was their understanding. Nothing can harm the temple because God lives here. And then Jeremiah gets up and says, that's all malarkey. Whether God lives here or not, God's not going to live here very long because this whole temple is going to go down into shambles. And the best thing for you people to do is pack your bags and head over to Babylon because that's where you're going to end up. Well, that would have sounded like idiocy to us. It would have sounded like blasphemy to us. And so immediately they tried to kill Jeremiah, but he had some buddies and they got him out of there. But that chapter 7 is very important because it's kind of like Jesus is modeled in the Gospel of Mark in this temple scene on that chapter 7. So that's what Jesus has in effect done. He's not worried about the buying and the selling or the building. He's just saying everything for which this temple was built, the spiritual integrity of our people. That temple is supposed to symbolize justice, peace and harmony and all of those kinds of things. And it does not. The rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. Nobody cares for the widow, nobody cares for the orphan. Business deals are rampant in corruption, and all in the name of holy religion. And so that's what he's saying. And that's going to be the reason for the plot. And when the chief priests and scribes heard it, they kept looking for a way to kill him, for they were afraid of him, because the whole crowd was spellbound by his teaching. As soon as this happens, then, goes outside again. He's with his disciples. And disciples say, hey, come over here, look at this. Go over there, there's that fig tree. Remember that fig tree? Yeah, it's still there. Except now it's all wilted up. It's just like dried up, ready to blow away. And Jesus looks at that and kind of reminds him, yeah, well, that's what I said. What is that about? Well, obviously, the fig tree symbolizes the temple. That's what that fig tree is all about. That fig tree symbolizes the temple. And right before Jesus went into the temple, he let the fig tree have it. He went into the temple. He let the temple have it. He comes out, and it's all there done. It's wilted up, just like the temple ultimately will be all wilted up. So he goes on now. He's still in Galilee. And he does a lot of healings, does a lot of proclaiming about that mission statement. The time is fulfilled. The kingdom of God has come near. His disciples, now Mark has an interesting view on discipleship. He thinks that the actual disciples that Jesus calls don't quite fit the bill. And what he's trying to do is teach his community about discipleship. And one of the interesting ways that Mark is going to do that is by showing us how not to be a disciple. And then showing us how to be a disciple. And the way in which you should not be a disciple is by following these disciples in the story. Now remember, this is not a historical, factual presentation. So if you're asking yourself, were the disciples as dumb as rocks like they're depicted here? Well, probably not, no. But this is a literary approach. He's not interested in what really were the disciples. He's trying to make a point. These disciples will be interested in power, fame, glory, all that kind of stuff, status. And he thinks that's wrong-headed. What Mark will then do to counter that is he will portray Jesus in such a way that he should be our model. Jesus is the ideal disciple in this gospel. The other disciples are really going to be failures. So we will watch, if you're reading along, chapter 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, as he goes along proclaiming, preaching, doing healings, watching the Pharisees and scribes get upset with him, watching his own disciples, loving the fact he does miracles, because miracles are all about power. And they want him to just set up shop. They want him to be up there in Galilee, and he keeps saying, come on, we got to move on. No, why not? Look, this is good. You're a hero. They love you. We could do it. We could just set up shop here. We'd never have to go anywhere. This would be great. And they're just flabbergasted when he says, I'm not interested in that business plan. I'm not interested in any of that. I am to go on and proclaim the gospel to other places. And they just scratch their head and say, how on earth can you miss such an opportunity? They wouldn't. But on the other hand, they don't have a clue when he talks about who he really is. Now Mark will then take his gospel, and right in the center, Mark has 16 chapters, starting with chapter 8, verse 27, and going all the way through chapter 10. He's going to develop his understanding of discipleship. And he's going to do it in a very creative way. He's going to do it around Jesus predicting his own suffering, death, and resurrection. It'll start in chapter 8, verse 27. And so things haven't been going too well, but okay, now he's got his disciples with him. In chapter 6, he went home to Nazareth, and he didn't get a good reception. He hadn't been home since he left. He went home, and the people thought he was just somebody who used to be amongst them, now went up and got acclimated to how the rich and famous people live, and now he's going to come back down and tell us how we ought to live our lives. And they weren't impressed with him at all. He, in turn, was shocked by their hardness of heart, and because of that, he could do no miracles there. And so it was not a good thing. They ended up thinking he's a fraud. He won't go back into any other town until now he goes into Jerusalem. He'll stay on the outskirts doing his work. And so he calls his disciples together and he says, I'm kind of interested in what the rumors are that are floating around. Who do people say that I am? Oh, you know, John the Baptist brought back to life. Elijah, some say that, we've heard that. And one of the prophets, you know, maybe Jeremiah, something like that. Well, that's all probably true, what they were saying. But then he looks him right in the eye. Who do you say I am? You, who do you say I am? Peter jumps right up. You are the Messiah. Well, that's shocking because it's right. Peter's not really known for his depth of brilliance usually. But here he got it, nailed it. That's exactly the right understanding. So what happens then? Well, then Jesus says to himself anyway, well, if they know who I am, and I am the Messiah, and they know that, then I'm going to tell them what's going to happen to me. And so here's what he says. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed. And after 3 days, rise again. You can find that verse in chapter 8, verse 31. So that's how he understands himself. Well, what happens? What's the response? Well, he said all this quite openly, the text says, and Peter, the guy who we just gave an A over here for his right answer, Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Not just have a little discussion, rebuke what Jesus had just said regarding what it means to be the Messiah. And then, of course, he takes Peter aside and he rebukes him. And so they're in a knockdown, drag out. And finally, Jesus even says, "Get behind me, Satan." That's a curse. What happened? If we would have been there, we actually would have been on the side of Peter. Peter would have made sense to us. Jesus wouldn't. Especially if we had come to believe Jesus was the Messiah, we probably would have had those typical, as we talked about yesterday, ideas of a Messiah: anonymity, royalty, being a warrior, the Daniel mysticism, Son of Man floating in on a cloud, totally victorious. And what does he say to us? None of that. Not one single ounce of any of that. The Son of Man must undergo great suffering. No Messiah goes under great suffering. And be rejected by the elders, his own people, chief priests, religious officials, scribes, the lawyers of the day. And be killed. Well, we already know a dead Messiah is a contradiction in terms. And he does always say after 3 days, rise again, but nobody seems to hear that. They can't get beyond the suffering and death. So, finally calls them together again, and he gives them a teaching. Now you'll notice He'll do this 3 times. He will have 3 times Jesus will talk about his suffering and death. 3 passion predictions. When you read that, you'll notice it's the same structure each time. Jesus will predict his passion. That will be followed by a misunderstanding on the part of the disciples, just like Peter here totally misunderstood it. That will be followed by a corrective teaching that Jesus will offer in terms of what it means to be a disciple. So you have prediction, misunderstanding, corrective teaching. That'll be 3 times. Same structure, 3 different times. Here's the corrective teaching for that first group. So he and Peter have been at it, they knocked one another around a bit. Now he calls them. He called the crowd with his disciples. Whenever Mark brings in the crowd, that's us. So we're here. And he said to them, now here's his corrective teaching regarding discipleship. And remember what we as disciples want. Power, glory, fame, any of that stuff will work. All of it. If any want to become my followers, we'd all say, yep, I'm on. Let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. Well, the hand will go down immediately now. That ain't what we're after. Deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. Some people say, Jesus could not have said this, especially about taking up his cross, because he hadn't taken up a cross yet. That must be somebody coming in later on and putting that in there. But not necessarily. Remember, crucifixion had been in practice for at least 300 years. By the time Jesus came around, it was seemingly initiated in Persia. And always from the beginning, it was understood to be a degrading form of capital punishment reserved for runaway slaves and insurrectionists. Even in Persia, that's what it was. It could easily, by the time of Jesus, had gained that reputation of when you take up your cross, you're taking up death. A form of death that is a degrading form of death, usually reserved only for the runaway slave and the insurrectionist. So that could have easily been Jesus saying, you know what? Here's how we have to go. Then he continues on. For those who want to save their life will lose it. Now, how does that make sense? If you want to save your life, I'll tell you what you need to do. You need to lose it. Well, you're going to look at it. That's really dumb. We all know you want to gain your life. You get out there and gain it. You go out there and make it. You do it. Where I was raised, we always had the same thing. When you grow up, you got to go to school. Oh, right. For what? Well, because you got to learn things. Why do I have to learn things? So you can get a good job. Well, why do I need a good job? So you can make money. And what am I going to do with money? You're going to buy the most important thing you can, which is security. The more I have, the better off I will be. How much money is enough? You ever asked that? Warren Buffett was asked that once. Warren, how much money is enough? The answer, oh, just a little bit more. That's how I was educated, Didn't work out, but that's how it was. You're supposed to get it. Everything we see, when you're watching TV or you're hearing people, they're always telling us, get out there, be number one, get it all. You never have enough. Your insurance company has never, ever come to you and said, oh, you're way overinsured. Let me give you a refund check. No, they're not going to say. They're going to come to you and say, we examined your policy. And the protection you have against three-legged dinosaurs is really insufficient. You might say, well, the last three-legged dinosaur that swam into Nassau, that was a long, long time ago. Well, see, you just never know. You never know. And so you're going to go away feeling really good because now I'm fully protected. That's great. Cost me a fortune, but I'll feel good. I'll feel secure. What's wrong with that? Well, what's wrong with that is it's a myth. There is no such thing as security. Nothing. There is no way you can secure your life. And the great antidote to all that, the reason we can show that's the case, is because of death. We don't know when it will happen. Now, none of us here, right now, think we are going to die anyway soon. You know, I've got things to do tomorrow. I've got plans. I cannot die tomorrow. And you probably got more plans than I do, and so all the more so, you can't die. And if you die, then nobody will show up tomorrow, and I'll be mad. And so all that. Security, think about it. It's what we all want. It's what everybody promises us. Just do this. Go here. Believe that. Backlog that. But it's a myth. That's the meaning of life that Jesus says you have to lose. Because we've been sold a bill of goods. It's not life at all. It's not life. The more you have, the more you need. And the more you need, the more you have to pay attention to how to keep it. And that's what we, how much this, that, and so. It's really odd. How do you get rid of it? Well, just let it go. If you want to save your life, you have to lose it. And do it for His sake. And for the sake of the gospel. Well, the disciples don't hear that at all. But now He's telling us, see, He's already told us once what's going to happen to Him. And what's going to happen to Him, a few chapters later, will be the heart of the whole passion narrative. But He's preparing us for that. He doesn't just rush into it. I mean, by the time we get to chapter 14, we've had a thorough education in who Jesus is and what's going to happen to Him and the choices we are able to make, which will either lead us down the path to following Him or lead us down some other path that really leads nowhere. And so Mark has very carefully put this together. He'll do it all over again. There is a second passion prediction, and it starts in chapter 9, verse 30. And he basically tells them the same thing. They went from there and passed through Galilee. He did not want anyone to know it, for He was teaching His disciples. Now, I don't know why that is in there. Why wouldn't He want anybody to know it? Because He's teaching His disciples. Well, maybe He doesn't want them to know how dumb the disciples seem to be. And so He didn't want anybody to know how this is all working out. But anyway, that's what He says. Here's what He was teaching them. It's the same thing. The Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands. They will kill Him, and 3 days after being killed, He will rise again. Now notice, He always talks about rising again, but nobody latches onto that. Nobody sees that as countering the earlier part. They just can't get by the suffering and death. So here's the misunderstanding. He's talking about suffering, death. Here's what they were doing. But they did not understand what He was saying, and were afraid to ask Him. If you see and read that section and you want to know, well, what were they talking about on the way? They were talking about who was the greatest. He's talking about who's the least. He's talking about suffering and death. And what are they talking about? Who among us you think is the greatest? I think it's probably me. Well, I don't think it's you at all. Not the way you act. Well, it is. It's me. I'm certainly far greater than... How far off could you be? How far off could you be? And so he'll give us once again a corrective teaching. Chapter 9, verse 35 to 37. He sat down, called the 12, and said to them, whoever wants to be first, that's us, we want to be first. But whoever wants to be first must be last of all, and servant of all. Then he took a little child, put it in among them, and taking it in his arms, he said to them, whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me. Now, they had all caught that. We don't always catch that. We kind of think that's a cute little thing, a little child. He's telling us we should go back and begin and, be innocent and all that, but he's not. Children were the lowest level on the social ladder. Children had no rights, really. It doesn't mean they didn't like them or love them, but a child was as low as you could get. And so they would have understood exactly what he's talking about, because they want to be on the highest rung, and he is saying the only way you get on the highest rung is by being on the lowest rung. And they would not have liked that. In other words, to be my disciple, in the eyes of the world, you have to become nothing. And they will not be able to manage that. So we begin to see how it's unfolding. The tension is going to start mounting. Tomorrow we'll look at just one more prediction real quick and then move on to some later things. But you begin to see how Mark is putting this together, and that the passion narrative as such really began almost in the opening chapter. Some scholars used to refer to the Gospel of Mark as a passion narrative with a real long introduction. And that's really what it is. And so he's starting to prepare us piece by piece for when the real event happens, beginning in chapter 14. So we'll continue with this and watch the thing unfold some more tomorrow. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit,